I gave up 3 years of my life to keep my father alive, and in the end, a piece of paper said, I never showed up at all. That's the part that still catches in my throat when I tell the story. Not the money, not the house, the paper. Because paper doesn't remember the nights I slept in a hospital recliner with my neck bent at an angle that took weeks to unlearn. Paper doesn't remember the sound my father made when the pain medication wore off at 3 in the morning, or the way I learned to mix his liquid meals so he wouldn't choke. My name is Emily Carter. I was 34 years old when my whole family decided I was a liar, a thief, and a stranger. It started the week after we buried my father, George Carter, in a cemetery outside Ohio with a view of a cornfield he always said reminded him of his own childhood. My brother Victor stood next to me at the funeral in a tailored black coat, his hand resting on our mother's shoulder, playing the part of the grieving, responsible son so convincingly that even I almost believed it. I didn't know yet that he had already met with a lawyer. At the reception after the burial, people kept approaching me with the same soft, careful expressions, the kind reserved for someone they assume is fragile. An old family friend, a woman my father had known since before I was born, took both my hands in hers and said, "He was so lucky to have you at the end, Emily. So lucky." I remember feeling for one brief moment like maybe the last 3 years had been seen after all. Like maybe someone besides me understood what it had cost. Victor stood a few feet away during that conversation, nodding along, his expression unreadable. Later, when the guests had thinned out, I caught him watching me across the room with an expression I couldn't place at the time. I know now that it was a calculation. I didn't know it then. I only knew that my brother, who had missed nearly every hard moment of the previous 3 years, was suddenly the one people looked to for what came next. I didn't know that somewhere in a folder in his car, there was a will I had never seen, with a signature that didn't look quite like my father's shaking hand. I found out 4 days later, standing in my parents' kitchen, when Victor slid a document across the table and said, in a voice so calm it made my skin crawl, "Dad wanted to make things simple for everyone. I want you to understand something before I go further. I wasn't fighting for money. I was fighting because I knew, in the marrow of my bones, that the man who raised me would never have cut me out with nothing while rewarding a son who visited 4 times in 3 years. But knowing the truth and proving it turned out to be 2 very different battles. And for a long time I was losing both. To understand how any of this became possible, you have to go back to the year everything changed, the year my father was diagnosed. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were the day I usually had my performance review at the marketing firm where I'd worked for 6 years, the job I was quietly proud of, the one with my name on a nameplate outside a real office door. That Tuesday, I got a phone call instead. My father's voice sounded thin on the line, thinner than I'd ever heard it. "They found something on the scan," he said. "The doctor wants to talk to both of us." I sat in the parking garage of my office building for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive to the hospital. When I got there, my mother, Carol Carter, was already in the waiting room, twisting a tissue into something unrecognizable. Victor wasn't there. Victor was traveling for work, as he so often was. The diagnosis was a slow, cruel kind of cancer, the kind that gives you time but takes it back a little every month. My father was told he had, if he was fortunate and responded to treatment, maybe 3 to 5 years. He got 3. I made a decision in that hospital corridor that I never once regretted, even on my hardest nights. I asked my manager for a leave of absence. When the company couldn't guarantee my position after 6 months, I resigned. My mother couldn't manage his medications and his appointments alone. She has never been comfortable with hospitals, ever since her own mother passed in one, and Victor was 3 states away, building what he called a career that mattered. So I moved back into my parents' house. I learned the names of medications I couldn't pronounce a year earlier. I learned to read blood work. I learned which hospice nurses were kind and which ones rushed, and I learned to advocate for my father when he was too exhausted to advocate for himself. "You don't have to do all this, Emmy," he told me once, using the nickname he'd used since I was small. We were sitting on the back porch, a blanket over his knees, even though it was June. "You had a whole life. This is my life right now," I told him. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." He reached over and took my hand, and I remember his fingers were cold, and I remember thinking, I will hold on to this feeling for the rest of my life, whatever happens. There were harder nights than that one, plenty of them. I remember the night his fever spiked and the home health monitor kept beeping in a pattern I didn't recognize, and I called the after-hours hospice line with my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. I remember learning to change a wound dressing without flinching because flinching, I quickly discovered, only made him more afraid. I remember the particular exhaustion of grocery shopping at 11 at night because it was the only hour I had free, wandering fluorescent aisles half asleep, buying foods he probably wouldn't be able to keep down anyway, just in case. None of that made it into any courtroom later. None of that fits neatly into a single exhibit or a signed document. But it was the actual shape of those 3 years, and I want you to know it because it's the part of the story no lawyer ever asked me to describe. Victor called every few weeks. He sent flowers on Father's Day. Twice a year, he flew in for a weekend, took our father out to a nice restaurant, posted a photo, and flew back out before the harder conversations. The ones about hospice care, about DNR forms, about what came next, ever had to happen. My mother adored him for it. At least Victor makes time to enjoy him, she said once, not unkindly, but the words landed like a slap anyway. As if the years I spent managing his pain charts weren't also a form of love. As if joy and duty couldn't live in the same house. I didn't argue. I was too tired to argue. I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit, as long as my father was comfortable, as long as he knew he wasn't facing this alone. There was a particular Sunday near the end of that first year that I still think about. Victor had flown in for what he called a quick visit, and he took our father to his favorite steakhouse downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a wine list. My father used to joke he needed reading glasses just to survive. I stayed home because someone needed to prep the evening medications and because, frankly, I hadn't been invited. When they came back, my father was glowing, more animated than I'd seen him in weeks, telling me about the wine Victor had ordered and the story Victor had told about a client in Chicago. I sat and listened and smiled, genuinely happy to see him lit up like that. Later, after my father had gone to bed, Victor found me in the kitchen washing dishes. "You're doing a good job with him," he said, almost as an afterthought, already checking his phone. "I mean that." "Thank you," I said, surprised. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd gotten from him in months. "I just wish Mom would stop comparing us," he added, and there was something in his tone I couldn't quite place at the time. Not warmth exactly, more like the careful positioning of a man measuring the room before he moves the furniture. I didn't think anything of it then. I had no reason to. I was wrong about that. It mattered more than I could have imagined. The lies didn't arrive all at once. They arrived the way water gets into a foundation, slowly, quietly, until one day the whole structure is compromised and nobody can say exactly when it started. It began with small comments. My aunt mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd heard I was handling all of Dad's finances now. I hadn't been. I managed his pill schedule and his appointments, not his bank accounts. But the comment sat there, a seed. Then came the moment I should have paid closer attention to. About 8 months before my father passed, Victor flew in for what he called a business trip that happened to line up. He spent 2 afternoons alone with our father in his study. I remember being relieved, actually. I thought, finally some real time together, just the two of them. I didn't know that during one of those afternoons, Victor had arranged for a document preparation service. Not our family's longtime attorney, a stranger recommended by one of Victor's colleagues, to visit the house. I didn't know because I was at the pharmacy. I was always at the pharmacy or the lab or on hold with the insurance company, doing the invisible work that never makes it into anyone's story. I remember coming home that particular afternoon with a bag of prescriptions and a rotisserie chicken because my father had mentioned, offhand, that he missed the smell of a real dinner cooking. Victor's rental car was still in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see 2 men in gray suits sitting at the dining table with my father, papers spread out in front of them, Victor standing behind his chair with a hand on his shoulder. "Business," Victor said when I walked in, sliding the papers into a leather folder before I could see them clearly. "Boring stuff. Insurance renewal." I believed him. That's the part one still have trouble forgiving myself for. Not the betrayal itself, but how easy it was for me to accept a simple explanation from my own brother, because why would I ever imagine he was lying to my face in our father's kitchen? My father looked tired that evening, more tired than usual, and when I asked if he wanted to talk about the visit, he just patted my hand and said, "Just Victor handling some things. Don't worry about it, Emmy." I didn't worry about it. Not then. After my father died, the change in the air was almost immediate. My mother started speaking to me differently. Careful, distant, like I was a coworker rather than her daughter. Family friends who used to hug me at the door started finding reasons to end conversations quickly. I finally asked my mother directly, in her kitchen, 3 weeks after the funeral. "Mom, why does everyone look at me like I did something wrong?" She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Victor says you were controlling the money at the end. He says the accounts don't add up." "That's not true," I said, and I heard my own voice crack, not from anger, but from disbelief. "I have every receipt, every pharmacy printout. You can look at all of it." "Victor has papers too," she said quietly. "He says he needs to protect what's left of the estate. From both of us, if it comes to that." That was the first time I understood this wasn't a misunderstanding I could clear up with a folder of receipts. This was a story Victor had been building, brick by brick, for months, long before our father's last breath. And he had built it in front of an audience that already wanted to believe the version where the golden sun swoops in to save the family, rather than the version where the daughter who stayed did the actual saving. Within a month, 2 of my father's oldest friends stopped returning my calls. My mother mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Victor thought it would be better for everyone if I found somewhere else to stay while things got sorted out. I want to be honest with you. There was a night, sitting alone in a motel room with a box of my father's letters on the bed beside me, when I thought about simply walking away, letting Victor have the house, the money, the story. I was exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. But then I opened one of those letters, an old one from years before his diagnosis, a birthday card my father had written when I turned 25. At the bottom, in his familiar looping handwriting, he'd written, "You are the one who shows up, Emmy. Never let anyone tell you that doesn't count for everything." I folded the card, put it back in the box, and decided I wasn't finished. The next morning, I drove to the pharmacy where I'd filled my father's prescriptions for 3 years, and I asked the pharmacist, a soft-spoken man named Farouk, who had watched my father's decline up close, if the store kept records of who picked up medications and when. He printed me 18 months of pickup logs without hesitation. My name was on almost every single one. I drove to the hospital billing office next and requested copies of every appointment sign-in sheet from the past 2 years. My signature, my handwriting, appeared beside my father's on nearly all of them. Victor's appeared twice. None of it, by itself, would undo a signed will. But I began to understand something Patricia would later put into words far better than I could. The truth doesn't need to win every argument. It only needs enough small, undeniable facts stacked closely enough together that the lie can no longer stand up straight. I started a folder of my own. I labeled it, simply, "Everything I Can Prove." A week later, I ran into Monica at a coffee shop near my new apartment, the same friend Victor had called with his carefully placed concerns. She looked uncomfortable the moment she saw me, and I almost let her walk past without saying anything. Instead, I asked her to sit down for 5 minutes. "I'm not asking you to pick a side," I told her. "I'm asking you to look at something." I showed her the pharmacy logs, the appointment records, the calendar I'd kept for 3 years marking every medication change. I watched her expression shift as she flipped through the pages, the careful neutrality dissolving into something closer to shame. "He told me you'd emptied one of the accounts," she said quietly. He sounded so sure. "Look at the bank statements yourself sometime," I said. "I have copies if you want them." She didn't take the copies that day. But 3 weeks later, she called Patricia's office on her own, saying she remembered small details from those years. A birthday dinner I'd missed because my father had a fever, a wedding I'd skipped because his oxygen levels dropped that same afternoon. Details that painted a very different picture than the one Victor had been telling. She wasn't the witness who would ultimately change everything. But she was the first person outside my own household to choose truth over comfort, and I've never forgotten that she did. If you have never had your own family turn a version of you into a stranger, I hope you never do. It is a particular kind of grief, separate from losing my father, and in some ways harder, because grief for the dead has an ending. This kind of grief just kept finding new rooms to move into. Within 3 months, Victor had filed the will he claimed our father signed during one of those private study sessions, a document that left the house, the retirement accounts, and nearly all of my father's modest but meaningful estate to Victor, with a single clause noting that Emily has been provided for in other ways and requires no further inheritance. There was no explanation of what those other ways were. There didn't need to be. The sentence did its job. It planted doubt. My mother, still reeling and desperate for someone to lean on, chose to lean on Victor. He was, after all, physically present in a way I no longer was, since I'd been asked to leave the house. He brought her groceries. He sat with her in the evenings. He made himself indispensable in the exact months when she was most vulnerable to being told what to believe. I lost the house I grew up in. I lost access to photographs, letters, and small keepsakes that had no monetary value, but meant everything to me. When I asked to retrieve a box of my father's old cassette tapes, recordings he'd made of himself reading bedtime stories when I was young, saved because our home had once flooded and he'd been terrified of losing them, Victor told me, through a lawyer, that personal property disputes would be handled separately. Reputation is a strange, fragile thing. It takes years to build and, apparently, about 6 weeks to dismantle if the person dismantling it is charming enough and speaks with enough confidence in front of the right people. Former co-workers messaged me, gently, to ask if the rumors were true, that I'd been caught mismanaging my father's finances. Neighbors who used to wave now looked at their phones when I walked by. Even my closest friend, Monica, admitted that she'd fielded a phone call from Victor just checking in, during which he'd mentioned, casually, that he was worried about my financial decisions during my father's illness. I remember sitting in my car outside a grocery store, unable to go inside because I'd just seen a woman from my old book club and watched her decide, in real time, to walk the other way rather than say hello. That was the lowest point. Not the money. Not even the house. It was the specific, suffocating loneliness of being disbelieved by people who had known me for decades, replaced almost overnight by a story that was easier to accept because it required no one to feel guilty for not asking harder questions. I remember thinking, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror, I did everything right, and it still wasn't enough to be believed. There was one night near the bottom of that stretch, when Victor called me directly, something he almost never did. I nearly didn't answer. "You should just sign the settlement," he said, without any preamble. "It's not worth destroying what's left of this family, Emily." "You destroyed it," I said. "I'm just trying to find out what actually happened." There was a pause on the line, long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. "Dad wanted this to be simple," he said finally. "I'm just carrying out what he wanted." "Then you won't mind if a judge looks at everything," I said, and I hung up before my voice could break. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time afterward, turning his words over. Dad wanted this to be simple. It was such a small phrase, and yet something about the way he said it, too smooth, too rehearsed, planted the first seed of a theory that would later prove to be exactly right, that Victor wasn't protecting our father's wishes. He was protecting a story he had built to look like our father's wishes. I was about to learn that being right and being believed are sometimes separated by nothing more than a single piece of evidence nobody has found yet. Around that same time, I made the difficult decision to sell my car, a small, practical thing, but it felt enormous. Legal fees were mounting faster than I'd expected, and Patricia, to her credit, never once made me feel small for asking about payment plans. "Most of my clients in cases like yours run out of money before they run out of truth," she told me once. "It's one of the reasons people like your brother count on you giving up." I took a part-time job at a small design studio downtown, working far below what I used to do, just to keep afloat while the case dragged on. My new co-workers didn't know anything about the trial, and there was something almost peaceful about that anonymity. A few hours a day where I wasn't the daughter who supposedly stole from her dying father, just a woman formatting brochures and drinking bad coffee. I held on to that peace like a small, private secret because everywhere else in my life, it felt like the walls kept closing in a little further each week. I hired an attorney named Patricia Alvarez, a small, sharp-eyed woman who had handled estate disputes for over 20 years and who told me, in our very first meeting, "I'm not going to promise you this will be easy. Wills are hard to challenge, and juries and judges like clean stories. Right now, Victor has a clean story." She was right. In the courtroom, over the first 2 days of the hearing, Victor's version of events unfolded with an unsettling smoothness. His attorney presented text messages, some real, some subtly edited, though we wouldn't understand the extent of that until later, suggesting I had grown resentful of caregiving duties and had discussed getting my share early. Photographs from a single argument I'd had with my father, out of 3 years of devotion, were presented as evidence of a strained, difficult relationship. 2 former neighbors testified, with total sincerity, that they'd noticed me around less in the final months, without understanding that those were the months I was managing his hospice transition from a rented room down the street because the house had become too difficult for medical equipment. I watched Judge Marshall's face throughout the testimony. He was a measured man in his 60s who rarely reacted, but I noticed on the second day a small furrow forming between his brows whenever Victor's attorney pushed a little too hard, layered a little too much theatrical outrage onto a story that was, on paper, simply about disputed inheritance. I held onto that furrow like a life raft. My own testimony felt like shouting into the wind. I described the medication schedules, the hospital nights, the years given up. Victor's attorney, in cross-examination, asked with practiced gentleness, "Isn't it true, Ms. Carter, that caregiving arrangements sometimes create financial expectations?" "I didn't do it for money," I said. "I did it because he was my father." "Of course," the attorney said, in a tone that suggested the opposite, and moved on before I could say more. During a recess that same afternoon, I stood in the courthouse hallway trying to steady my breathing when Victor approached, alone, his mother nowhere in sight. "You could still stop this," he said quietly. "For Mom's sake." "You mean for yours," I said. "I mean it doesn't have to end with one of us destroyed," he said, and for one brief moment, something flickered across his face that almost looked like guilt. Almost. Then it was gone, smoothed over by the same composure that had carried him through every deposition. Think about it before closing arguments. I didn't answer him. I walked back into the courtroom instead, and I sat down next to Patricia, and I told myself that whatever happened next, at least I would know I hadn't looked away from the truth. By the end of the second day, even Patricia looked tired. In the hallway outside the courtroom, she told me quietly, "I won't lie to you. If this were decided today, I think we'd lose." There was a moment during the second day I haven't mentioned yet because it still stings a little to remember. My mother took the stand, called as a witness by Victor's attorney, and testified, in a small, uncertain voice, that she'd noticed me becoming distant from my father in his final months. It wasn't a lie exactly. I had been physically absent more in those last weeks, arranging the hospice transfer, negotiating with insurance, handling the parts of dying that happen in offices, and on phone calls rather than at a bedside. But the way the question was framed made distance sound like abandonment, and my mother, still grieving and still trusting the version of events Victor had carefully constructed for her, answered honestly according to what she believed, even though what she believed wasn't true. I didn't blame her at that moment, not really. I understood, watching her from the gallery, that she was as much a casualty of Victor's story as I was. That understanding didn't make it hurt less. I went home that night, to the small rented apartment I'd moved into, half the size of my old bedroom growing up, and I sat on the floor with the box of my father's letters, the one thing Victor hadn't managed to take from me, because I'd grabbed it the day I left. I read through them one by one, searching for something, anything, that might help. I found a name I didn't recognize. In a letter my father had started but never finished, dated only a few weeks before he passed, he'd written, "I need to talk to Elizabeth about what happened yesterday. She'll understand why I'm worried." I had no idea who Elizabeth was. I brought the unfinished letter to Patricia the next morning, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something shift in her expression, not hope exactly, but the sharpening of a hunter who has just picked up a scent. Elizabeth, she repeated. Let's find out who was in his care team in those final weeks. It took 2 days of records requests, but we found her. Elizabeth Harris, a hospice nurse who had been assigned to my father's case during the last 2 months of his life. According to the hospice agency's schedule, she had been present for several of his evening visits that overlapped, curiously, with 2 of the dates Victor's private meetings with the document service had occurred. We subpoenaed her.
She didn't show.
The agency confirmed she still worked there, but said she had taken sudden medical leave and was unreachable. Patricia sent a certified letter. No response came. Days passed. The trial resumed, and still no nurse. I won't pretend I didn't spiral during that stretch. I lay awake running through worst-case scenarios, that Elizabeth had nothing useful to say at all, that the letter was about something entirely unrelated, that I had built false hope out of 6 unfinished words written by a man who was, by then, heavily medicated and not always lucid. Patricia was more measured. If she genuinely knows something, she told me, she'll come forward when she can. People who avoid subpoenas usually have one of 2 reasons. Either they're hiding something themselves, or they're protecting something bigger than their own convenience. In the meantime, life didn't pause for us to wait. Victor's attorney requested an expedited ruling, arguing that the delay caused by our unresponsive witness was a stalling tactic on our part. Judge Marshall denied the request, but not without a pointed comment directed at Patricia. Ms. Alvarez, I'll give you reasonable latitude, but this court cannot wait indefinitely for a witness who may never materialize. I remember sitting in the gallery that day, watching Victor lean over to whisper something to his attorney, the 2 of them sharing the kind of small, private smile that made my stomach tighten. He looked, for the first time since the funeral, like a man who believed he had already won. I went to visit my father's grave that evening, something I hadn't done since the funeral, because I couldn't bear the thought of standing there while everything he'd built was being quietly dismantled by the son he'd trusted. I sat on the grass in the fading light and told him, out loud, feeling foolish and desperate in equal measure, that I didn't know how much longer I could keep fighting. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the dry grass at the edge of the cemetery, and I told myself it meant nothing, that grief makes people look for signs where there are none. But I stayed a while longer anyway, and when I finally stood to leave, something in me had steadied, just slightly, enough to get through 1 more week. I didn't know which one it was. Neither did she. What I didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that Elizabeth Harris had been recovering from emergency gallbladder surgery in another state, staying with her daughter during recovery, entirely disconnected from local news and unaware that the family she'd cared for had ended up in a courtroom. She had no idea her name mattered to anyone until a nurse from her old hospice team, a woman named Grace who had covered some of her earlier shifts, mentioned during a phone call that a local paper had run a small piece on a contested Carter estate case. Elizabeth read the article from a hospital recovery chair 3 states away, and something she'd been quietly troubled by for months suddenly had a place to go.
We didn't know any of that yet.
All we knew, on the 6th day of trial, was that the closing arguments were being scheduled for the following week, and our one lead had gone silent. Patricia looked at me across her desk and said something I've never forgotten. Emily, I need you to prepare yourself. We may have to go into closing arguments with what we have. That night, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling through old photographs on my phone, looking for anything, some forgotten detail that might help. I stopped on a photo from the hospice, taken the week before my father passed, a nurse in the background, adjusting in 4-line, her face turned slightly away from the camera. I hadn't thought about her in months. I zoomed in, my heart picking up speed, and although the image was blurry, I recognized the same soft gray cardigan Elizabeth had been wearing in the one staff photo the hospice agency had on file. I sent the photo to Patricia at 11 that night. She called me back within minutes. It doesn't prove anything new, she said carefully, but it confirms she was present during exactly the window we care about. If she surfaces, her testimony will carry real weight. We just need her to surface. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about a woman I'd never properly met, somewhere out there, holding a piece of my father's truth in a folder I didn't know existed, and hoping, in a way I couldn't fully explain even to myself, that she would find her way to us before it was too late. The next morning, Patricia filed one last request with the court, asking for a 48-hour continuance before closing arguments, citing a potential material witness whose testimony could not have been reasonably anticipated earlier in proceedings. Victor's attorney objected loudly, calling it a delay tactic born of desperation. Judge Marshall studied both filings for a long moment before granting only 24 hours, warning that the trial would proceed with or without any new witness once that window closed. 24 hours. I spent most of them sitting by my phone, willing it to ring, while Patricia's paralegal made increasingly urgent calls to the hospice agency, to Elizabeth's last known address, to anyone who might know where she'd gone. By midnight, we still had nothing, and I remember lying awake, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, preparing myself for the very real possibility that we would walk into that courtroom the next day with only the evidence we already had, and that it might not be enough. The morning closing arguments were set to begin. I sat in the courtroom gallery in the same navy blazer I'd worn every day of the trial, because I couldn't afford another, and because some stubborn part of me refused to let Victor see me look defeated. Victor's attorney stood first, delivering a smooth, confident summary of everything the defense had presented: my supposed resentment, my supposed absence, the clarity of the will Victor had produced. I watched my mother in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, unable to look at me. Then, just as Patricia rose to begin our closing, the courtroom doors at the back opened. I heard them before I turned around, a slow, careful set of footsteps, the kind of walk of someone still recovering from something. An older woman entered, moving with visible effort, a small folder pressed against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Judge Marshall paused the proceedings. "Ma'am, this is an active hearing. Can I help you?" "My name is Elizabeth Harris," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "I was George Carter's hospice nurse. I understand there's a trial about his estate. I have information I believe the court needs to hear." For a moment, no one in the courtroom moved. Even the court reporter's fingers hovered above her keys. I felt Patricia's hand find mine under the table and squeeze once, hard, as if to say, "Hold on, this is it." The room went still in a way that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with attention. Patricia was on her feet in seconds, requesting the court allow testimony given the relevance and timing. Victor's attorney objected. Judge Marshall studied Elizabeth for a long moment, then said, "Given the gravity of the estate at stake, I'll allow limited testimony, subject to cross-examination." Elizabeth was sworn in. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened her folder. Not from nervousness, I would learn later, but from lingering weakness after her surgery. She described the final 2 months of my father's care in careful, unembellished detail, his pain levels, his moments of clarity, and his moments of confusion caused by high doses of medication. Then she described something none of us had heard before. "In the last few weeks," she said, "Mr. Carter told me he was worried. He said his son had brought some men to the house, not doctors, not his usual attorney, asking him to sign papers. He said he didn't fully understand what he was signing, but he felt he couldn't say no while his son was standing there." She reached into her folder and produced several handwritten pages. "These are letters Mr. Carter began writing during that period. He asked me to hold them because he was afraid they'd be found before he decided what to do with them. I kept them because that's what he asked of me, and because I was recovering from surgery when I learned this case had gone to trial. I came as soon as I could travel." Patricia requested the letters be entered into evidence. One, addressed to my father's original longtime attorney, not the document service Victor had brought in, stated plainly that he feared being pressured into signing new estate documents while under medication, and that he wanted a formal capacity assessment before any changes were finalized. That letter had never been sent. It had never reached its intended recipient. Because, as we would soon learn, it never left the house before Victor's document service visited 2 days later. The courtroom took on a different weight after that. Even Victor's attorney, for the first time in the entire trial, hesitated before objecting. During cross-examination, he tried to suggest that Elizabeth's memory, so many months later, couldn't be trusted, that grief and time distort recollection. Elizabeth listened patiently, her hands folded on top of her folder, and when he finished, she said simply, "Young man, I have cared for over 400 dying patients in my career. You remember the ones who were afraid. You remember the ones who tried to protect their children even while they were dying. George Carter was one of those. I don't need a good memory to recall that. I need a heart." The gallery was silent. Even Judge Marshall allowed himself the faintest nod before instructing the attorney to continue. I glanced at Victor for the first time since Elizabeth had entered the room. He was staring straight ahead, jaw tight, one hand gripping the edge of the defense table hard enough that his knuckles had gone pale. It was the first crack I had seen in him since the funeral. Justice, when it finally came, didn't arrive as a single dramatic thunderclap. It arrived the way real justice usually does, through the slow, careful accumulation of evidence that made one version of events impossible to sustain any longer. Patricia requested an emergency forensic review of the disputed will signature, comparing it against samples from the same week, including a grocery list and a birthday card my father had written just days before the document was allegedly signed. The forensic examiner, a meticulous man who spoke in careful, unemotional sentences, testified that the will's signature showed irregular pen pressure and hesitation marks consistent with a hand affected by heavy sedation, very different from the two comparison samples from the same period. Phone records, subpoenaed earlier but only now fully relevant, confirmed that Victor had scheduled the document preparation services visit directly, without informing our family's longtime attorney, and had specifically requested an appointment during a window when, according to medication logs Elizabeth corroborated, my father would have just received his evening dose. None of this required a villain twirling a mustache. Victor never had to be a cartoon. He simply made a series of choices, each individually deniable, that together formed a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. During a brief recess, while the forensic examiner's report was being formally entered, I stepped into the hallway for air and found my mother sitting alone on a bench, staring at nothing in particular. I sat beside her without speaking at first. "I keep thinking about the letter," she finally said. "The one he never sent. Why didn't he just tell one of us directly, if he was worried?" "I think he tried," I said carefully. "I think he told Victor's face something and told a nurse the truth, because he still loved his son and didn't know how else to protect himself without accusing him outright." My mother was quiet for a long moment. "That sounds like your father," she admitted. "He always looked for the version of a hard truth that hurt the fewest people." She looked at me then, really looked, in a way she hadn't in over a year. I think I did the same thing. I looked for the version that hurt the fewest people to believe. I'm sorry that version wasn't the true one. I didn't have an answer ready for that. I just reached over and took her hand, the way my father used to take mine, and for a moment, in that quiet hallway, it felt like something small and necessary was beginning to mend. Judge Marshall took 2 days to issue his ruling. When he did, he was measured, careful, and precise, the way he'd been throughout the trial. "The court finds," he said, "that the document purporting to be Mr. Carter's final will does not meet the standard required to establish valid testamentary capacity at the time of signing. Based on the forensic evidence, the corroborating testimony of Ms. Harris, and the decedent's own contemporaneous letters expressing concern, this document is set aside." He reinstated my father's previous, properly witnessed will, one drafted years earlier with our family's original attorney, dividing the estate equally between Victor and me, with a modest additional provision acknowledging my daughter Emily's tireless care in my final years, a line I hadn't even known existed until the judge read it aloud. Victor was referred to the State Bar's Fraud Investigation Unit for further review regarding undue influence and potential document fraud. I won't pretend that it gave me the satisfaction I once imagined it would. Mostly, I just felt tired and something close to relief. My mother approached me outside the courthouse, her face pale in the afternoon light.
"I believed him," she said.
"I should have asked you first."
"I'm sorry, Emmy."
I didn't have a perfect response for her. Some part of me wanted to be angry for a long time. Another part of me remembered that she, too, had been managed by someone skilled at managing people. I told her I needed time before I could figure out what our relationship would look like going forward, and she nodded, understanding, for the first time in months, that trust doesn't rebuild on the same schedule as a court case. Patricia found me on a bench outside the courthouse a while later, the late afternoon sun cutting long shadows across the steps. "You did the hard part," she said, sitting down beside me. "Most people give up long before the truth has a chance to catch up. You didn't." "I almost did," I admitted. "More than once." "Almost doesn't count," she said, and for the first time since I'd hired her, she smiled, an actual smile, tired but genuine. "Go home, Emily. Sleep. You've earned an easy night." I did sleep that night, the first full night's rest I'd had in over a year. People often ask me, when I tell this story, whether I ever spoke to Victor again. The honest answer is that we exchanged a handful of necessary, business-like conversations regarding the estate and nothing more. I didn't need a dramatic confrontation to feel whole. The ruling had already said everything that needed to be said. What I did instead was rebuild, slowly and on my own terms. I used my portion of the inheritance, not extravagant, never life-changing in the way the stories on this channel sometimes describe, but enough to do something I'd quietly dreamed about since those long nights managing my father's care. I opened a small community respite center, a place where family caregivers could bring their loved ones for a few hours of professional support, just enough time to breathe, to run errands, to remember they were still people outside of their caregiving role. I named it after nothing dramatic. Just a plain sign that reads Carter House Respite Care, because I wanted it to be a place, not a monument to what I'd survived. On opening day, Elizabeth Harris came, fully recovered, and cut the ribbon alongside me. "Your father would have liked this," she told me. "He talked about you more than you probably know." My mother came too, quietly, standing near the back, and for the first time in over a year, she hugged me without hesitation. A woman I didn't recognize approached me near the refreshment table, holding the hand of an older man in a wheelchair. "My husband has early-stage dementia," she said. "I haven't slept properly in 2 years. Is this really open to people like us?" "It's open to exactly people like you," I told her, and I watched something in her shoulders loosen, just slightly, the way mine used to loosen on the rare afternoons someone else took over my father's care for even an hour. 6 months later, we had a waiting list. Elizabeth volunteers there twice a week now, and sometimes in the quiet hours between clients, she tells me small stories about my father that I never had the chance to hear, things he said to her in the middle of the night when the pain was bad and the house was dark and I was finally, for once, asleep down the hall. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons at the center, I catch myself standing in the doorway watching a daughter feed her mother lunch, or a husband patiently guiding his wife's wheelchair down the ramp we had installed with the last of the settlement money, and I feel something settle in my chest that I don't have a better word for than peace. Not the loud, triumphant kind of peace you sometimes see promised in stories like this one. A quieter kind. The kind that comes from knowing you did right by someone, even when doing right cost you almost everything else. I think about my father often. Not the illness, not the will, not the trial, but the ordinary evenings on that back porch, his cold hand in mine, the blanket over his knees in June. I think about the fact that he wrote a letter he never got to send, and that somehow, through a nurse he trusted and a folder she carried for months, his voice still made it into that courtroom when it mattered most. If you're watching this and you've ever been the one who stayed, the one who gave up the promotion, the sleep, the social life, the easy version of things, I want you to hear this clearly. The world doesn't always notice the quiet work of loyalty while it's happening. Sometimes it takes a courtroom, or a stranger, or a letter someone almost didn't keep, for the truth to finally catch up to you. But it does catch up. Stay long enough, tell the truth long enough, and eventually someone walks through the door who can prove what you already knew. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Stories with Jolene, because the truth always finds its witness eventually.